I'm Dan, this is Guns & Guitars, and this is a review and demo of the Seymour Duncan STC Blackouts for Bass preamp. This episode of Guns & Guitars is brought to you by Aunt Lee, who got me a $50 Amazon gift card for my birthday that I used to buy this preamp. Thanks, Aunt Lee.
Too much awesome!
Okay, first let's take a look at the specs. You can buy this thing for $59 anywhere that sells them. It is a 2-band 9-volt active preamp. However, I did contact Seymour Duncan and they said no problems running the preamp at 18 volts if you decided you wanted to run a second 9-volt battery. It's available in 2 versions. I got the concentric knob version, which means that the bass and treble controls are both stacked on the same pot. But there is a version available that has separate pots for both your bass and your treble, if that's what you'd prefer. Now the bass control on this is a low shelf that you can boost or cut at 60 Hz. Now in my testing, I found that the slope actually starts around 75 Hz and then peaks at 60 Hz and below. The treble controls, you actually have 2 options. There is a micro switch installed right on the circuit board that you can select 2 different frequency bands. With the switch in the up position, it's a high shelf that boosts or cuts at 3.5 kilohertz. And in my testing, I found that the shelf starts at about 1.5K, slopes up to where it peaks out at 3.5K and above. Now, if you flip that switch into the down position, it actually shifts that shelf up to where it slopes up at 4K and peaks out at 6K and above. Now let's try this thing out and see how it sounds. For this test, I just installed the preamp into an old pickguard that I had, and instead of wiring it up directly to my bass's pickups, I wired it up to a standard 1/4-inch instrument cable. That way I can demo this thing without actually having to install it in my bass. I also wired in a mini toggle switch to bypass the preamp entirely. That way we can get a true A/B comparison of what this preamp is actually doing to our bass's tone. And for the sake of time, I'm only going to be demoing everyone's favorite and least favorite pickup combinations from my previous sound test of this bass. Everyone agreed that the least favorite sound was just the Music Man pickup by itself, so we'll start there. Now I agreed with everyone when they said originally that the Music Man pickup sounded really thin, but I think this preamp really brings it to life. Not only does it add that top end sparkle and bite, but it really fills in the low end to get that classic Music Man style sound. And now we're going to try it out on everyone's favorite pickup combinations that were the Neck+Bridge pickups together and all 3 pickups together. definitely beefs up the low end right in the sweet spot, and it adds a bit of sparkle to the highs too. Now you might be saying to me, Dan, you said there were 2 selectable frequencies for the highs. Why didn't you demo the 6K setting? Well, that's because a boost at 6K isn't all that helpful for bass. It really just translates to more fretboard noise and not so much the tone of the instrument itself. But since I know you guys are going to complain if I don't demo it, here's an A/B comparison between the 3.5K and the 6K settings. Okay, now do you see what I mean? I make my living as an audio engineer, and 6 kHz is not a frequency that I would ever boost on a bass. If I really wanted a bass to cut through the mix, I'd give it a boost around 1.5K to 4K. Anything above that's pretty much useless. And since that tiny little switch is mounted on the circuit board itself, it's not externally selectable. So I'm gonna leave it on the 3.5K setting when I install it on my bass. Now if Seymour Duncan ever decides to make that switch into an external mini toggle switch that you could change on the fly, then that would be a much more useful setting. That way, in the rare occasion that you did want a 6K boost, you could switch it without having to take your bass apart. Hint, hint, Seymour Duncan, external switch. But for all intents and purposes, 3.5K is the only setting you're really ever gonna use. So to summarize, things that are cool. It's affordable at just under 60 bucks. It can make cheap pickups come to life. The bass frequency is right in the sweet spot for my ears. And I didn't show you this in the demo, but with the EQ set to flat when I engaged the preamp, it didn't color the tone at all. And that's really cool. Lots of preamps will color the tone even with the EQ set to flat, but this one doesn't, which means that the frequencies you're boosting and cutting are as close as possible to the original frequencies your bass is generating. As a sound engineer, I can't tell you how valuable that is, especially at this price point. Things that suck! The 6K treble setting is basically worthless, but it wouldn't be as worthless if they had mounted an externally selectable switch. Hint, hint, external switch. At full blast, I thought that both treble settings were pretty harsh, but that's fixable by rolling off the treble just a tad. And you couldn't really hear in my sound demo, but when you really crank up the highs, you get a mild hiss, so it's kind of a noisy preamp. But at this price point, just about any preamp you're gonna get is gonna be kind of noisy, so you can't really be upset about that. But all in all, this preamp does sound pretty good, and it's gonna be an excellent addition to this bass. Now, if you wanna see how to install a preamp into a bass that didn't already have one before, subscribe to this channel, because in the next video, I'm gonna be carving out a spot in this bass for that preamp.